The man stumbled backward, his face a mixture of surprise and disbelief. Sophie stood firm, blocking any path that could lead to Ethan. She didn't flinch, her eyes locked on the man in front of her, silently daring him to make another move. The room was still, so still it was as if everyone had frozen in place. Ethan, caught off guard by Sophie's sudden display of courage, watched her with wide eyes, his mouth opening as if to say something but not finding the words. "What's going on?" he finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her actions had already spoken louder than any words could. The man who had entered the diner stood frozen for a moment, sizing up the situation. Sophie felt a twinge of recognition. This wasn't just any random intruder. This man was calculating, cold, and not easily intimidated. The faintest flicker of recognition passed across his face as he realized he wasn't going to get past her that easily. He straightened, and for the first time, Sophie saw the glint of something other than malice in his eyes. Curiosity. "You're not just a waitress, are you?" he said, his voice low, almost amused. Sophie's gaze didn't waver. "I'm exactly who I need to be right now," she replied, her voice steady, unwavering. Ethan, still stunned, looked between Sophie and the man. The tension in the room was palpable, but Sophie remained calm, her posture ready, waiting for the next move. "Why don't you just let me handle this?" Ethan's voice was now firm, the edge of his arrogance creeping back in, as if he was trying to regain control of the situation. But Sophie shook her head, never once breaking eye contact with the intruder. "This isn't your fight," she said, her voice a quiet reassurance. "Stay behind me." Ethan hesitated, his pride fighting with his growing sense of unease. He had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the terms of every situation. But here, in this quiet diner, facing a threat he didn't see coming, he was anything but in control. He found himself taking a step back, if only because Sophie made him feel like he had no choice. The man took another step forward, but Sophie mirrored his movements, closing any space between them. "I don't have time for this," the man muttered, glancing at the door as if weighing his options. Sophie stood firm, a silent barrier between him and Ethan. She wasn't about to let anything happen to the man she had been unknowingly protecting for years. Ethan, still processing the events unfolding before him, felt a strange sense of gratitude. It wasn't lost on him that Sophie, the quiet waitress he had never given a second thought to, had just saved his life. For a moment, he realized how little he truly understood the people around him, how often he had taken his power and influence for granted. Sophie wasn't just a waitress. She was someone with a past, with skills he could only guess at. "Who are you?" Ethan finally asked, the question escaping his lips before he could stop it. Sophie's eyes softened for just a moment, but she didn't answer. Instead, she glanced at the door again, noting how the man had started to back off, clearly deciding that he wasn't going to get what he came for. The room seemed to breathe again, the tension lifting just slightly. Ethan still didn't fully understand what had just happened, but one thing was clear. Sophie had just done more for him than anyone else ever had. He could feel the shift in the air. Something had changed, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. The man, realizing he was no longer in control of the situation, took a step back. "You're lucky I don't have time for this," he spat, his words laced with contempt. With one last glance at Sophie, he turned and left, disappearing into the storm. The door closed behind him, and the room exhaled, as if the world had returned to its normal pace. Ethan stood there for a moment, his mind racing. Sophie had saved his life, no questions asked, without even thinking twice. As he turned to her, she was already walking back to her station, her movements calm and purposeful, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling small and inadequate. Sophie didn't look back. She simply nodded and went on with her work, her face an unreadable mask. Ethan stood frozen for a moment longer, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The storm raged outside, but inside, the world felt different, more uncertain. And it was all because of a waitress who had just become far more important than he could have ever imagined. The evening continued as if nothing had happened, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. He watched Sophie from the corner of his eye as she moved between tables, her quiet efficiency a sharp contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. He had been in countless situations where he had controlled the narrative, the outcome, but tonight had been different. It wasn't just the threat that had made him uncomfortable. It was the realization that someone else had taken charge without hesitation, without asking for permission. Sophie was the one who had saved him, and in doing so, she had unknowingly torn down the walls he had spent years building around himself. Ethan took another sip of his drink, trying to focus on something else, anything else, but his mind kept returning to her. Sophie, the waitress who had just become far more important than he had ever imagined. When the dinner rush started to slow down, and the last few customers were finishing their meals, Ethan found himself standing up and walking toward the counter. Sophie was wiping down the surface, her movements still precise, still effortless. She didn't look up when he approached, but he knew she was aware of him. "You saved my life tonight," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Sophie didn't stop wiping the counter, but she did pause for a moment. It was a brief moment, but it was enough to let him know she had heard him. "I just did what needed to be done," she replied quietly, her voice steady but distant. Ethan wasn't sure what he had expected. Maybe some sort of acknowledgement, some indication that she understood the gravity of the situation. But Sophie didn't seem interested in the fanfare. She wasn't seeking praise or recognition. "Why did you do it?" Ethan asked before he could stop himself. "You don't even know me." Sophie finished her task and set the rag down before meeting his gaze. Her eyes were calm, almost serene, and for the first time, Ethan realized how much she was holding back. "Sometimes you just do what's right," she said simply. "It's not about knowing someone. It's about doing what needs to be done." Ethan was taken aback by her response. It was so different from everything he had known. His world had always been about control, about having power over every situation. But Sophie, she wasn't concerned with control. She was concerned with what was right. And that thought lingered with him, gnawing at him, as he stood there in silence. Sophie, on the other hand, seemed to have already moved on. She picked up the rag again and began wiping down another table, her movements as calm and deliberate as ever. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, watching her, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had expected to feel gratitude, maybe even a sense of indebtedness, but instead, he felt something else, something that was unfamiliar. He felt small. Sophie had done something that he could never have done in his world. She had acted out of pure instinct, out of a sense of duty, without hesitation or thought for her own safety. And in doing so, she had reminded him of something he had long forgotten. There were people in the world who weren't motivated by power, by wealth, by status. People like Sophie, who acted out of kindness and courage, without expecting anything in return. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a shift inside himself. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He was used to controlling the narrative, to manipulating situations to his advantage, but Sophie had made him realize how hollow that pursuit could be. Maybe it was time for him to start doing things differently. He wasn't sure what that meant yet, but he knew one thing for sure. Sophie had just shown him a different way of living, a way that didn't involve constantly fighting for control. As he turned to leave, he glanced back at Sophie one last time. She was still working, still moving with that quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from her. Ethan couldn't help but admire her, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to do anything about it. He simply walked out of the diner, the sound of the storm outside the only thing that seemed to matter in that moment. The days that followed were strange for Ethan. He found himself returning to the diner more often, but not just for the food or even for business meetings. There was something about Sophie that drew him in, something he couldn't quite place. He had always been in control of his environment, of the people around him. But Sophie was different. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't trying to impress him, wasn't trying to get anything from him. She simply existed in the moment, quiet and composed. It frustrated him, in a way he hadn't expected. Sophie didn't make small talk or try to fill the space with meaningless chatter. She greeted him politely, took his order, and did her job with a quiet efficiency that Ethan found mesmerizing. Every time he sat down at her table, he couldn't help but notice how effortlessly she moved around him, as though she were entirely unbothered by his presence. It made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't understand. Over time, Ethan began to realize that Sophie had an effect on him that no one else had ever had. It wasn't just her bravery the night of the attack. It was the way she moved through the world, with purpose and strength, without needing recognition or praise. He had always been admired for his achievements, his wealth, his power, but Sophie seemed to have none of those things, and yet she was somehow more powerful than anyone he had ever known. One evening, as the sun began to set and the soft light of the diner cast long shadows on the walls, Ethan found himself once again sitting at the counter, waiting for Sophie to take his order. As she approached, he saw something different in her eyes, a flicker of something deeper than the usual professionalism she carried. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his voice unusually soft. "How long have you been working here?" Sophie looked at him, her expression unreadable. "A few years," she replied simply. "It's been good. It's quiet." Ethan nodded, unsure of how to continue. He had never been good at small talk, and this wasn't exactly the time to start learning, but something about Sophie's calm demeanor made him feel as if he had to say something. "You've never really told me much about yourself," he said, leaning forward slightly. Sophie gave a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "There's nothing much to tell," she said, her voice calm. "I prefer it that way." Ethan studied her for a moment, the weight of her words settled in him. She had always been so private, so careful to keep her distance, but he felt the need to know more. "You're not just a waitress, are you?" he asked, his tone quieter now, as if he were trying to peel back the layers she had carefully built around herself. Sophie's gaze flickered for a moment, and for the first time, Ethan thought he saw a flicker of something vulnerable in her eyes. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by her usual calm exterior. "I'm exactly who I need to be," she said softly, almost as if it were a mantra. Ethan couldn't help but admire her. There was something so resolute in her, something that he had lost in himself long ago. She wasn't looking for validation. She wasn't seeking to prove anything to anyone. She simply existed, and in that existence, there was a quiet strength that seemed to overshadow everything around her. The next few days passed in a blur for Ethan. He continued to visit the diner, finding himself inexplicably drawn to Sophie's presence. There was no dramatic confrontation, no grand revelations, just quiet moments of understanding that seemed to pass between them with each passing day. And yet, Ethan felt as if he was being pulled into something far greater than he had ever imagined. He began to question the life he had built, the relentless pursuit of success, the people he had used along the way, the control he had fought so hard to maintain. Sophie didn't need any of it. She had something else, something that Ethan couldn't quite grasp, but something he desperately wanted to understand. One night, as he sat at the counter once again, watching Sophie move through the diner with her usual grace, he realized that he had been living his life all wrong. His success, his power, his money, they had all come at the expense of something far more important. He had been so focused on controlling everything around him that he had forgotten what it meant to truly live. Sophie, in her quiet strength, had reminded him of that. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan found himself wondering if it was too late to change. Sophie didn't ask for anything from him. She simply lived her life with integrity, with grace, and with a strength that no amount of money or power could ever buy. And in that moment, Ethan realized that he wanted more than anything to be a part of that world. He just wasn't sure if he could make that shift. Yet, for now, he simply watched, learning from the quiet waitress who had unknowingly opened his eyes to a different way of living. As the days passed, Ethan found himself unable to focus on anything other than Sophie. He had always prided himself on being in control, always knowing what came next. But with her, he felt like a spectator to a story he couldn't predict. It was maddening, in a way, but also strangely comforting. There was something about her calm, unwavering presence that made everything else fade into the background. She had an effortless way of existing, of moving through life with a quiet strength that seemed to make everything else feel less important. Every time Ethan visited the diner, he found himself sitting a little longer, watching her a little closer. He had tried to keep his distance, not wanting to complicate things, but it was impossible. He had to know more. Sophie never seemed to acknowledge the growing tension between them. She was always polite, always professional, and yet there was something in her eyes that spoke volumes. A few days after the last encounter, Ethan found himself at the diner again, his usual spot by the window. Sophie approached with the same quiet grace she always did, but this time, something was different. As she took his order, there was a flicker of something in her expression, something he couldn't quite place. "Is everything all right?" Ethan asked before he could stop himself, his voice softer than usual. Sophie paused for a brief moment, her gaze flickering as if she were deciding whether or not to speak. "Just tired," she said finally, her tone neutral. "It's nothing." Ethan studied her for a moment, sensing that there was more to the story. He had spent enough time around people to know when they were hiding something. And Sophie, for all her calm, was no exception. "If you ever need to talk, you know where to find me," he said, his voice unexpectedly sincere. Sophie didn't respond right away. She simply nodded and moved on to the next table, her movements as smooth and practiced as ever. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was weighing on her, something she wasn't willing to share. Later that evening, as the diner began to quiet down, Ethan found himself standing by the counter again, watching Sophie as she cleaned up. This time, he didn't hesitate. He walked over to her, his footsteps soft on the tile floor. "Sophie," he began, his voice gentle. "I know you don't talk about your past, but I can't help but feel like something's bothering you. You don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to, but if there's anything I can do, I'm here." Sophie looked up at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, they stood in silence, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Then, slowly, she placed the rag down and met his gaze. "I've never been good at asking for help," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "I've always had to rely on myself. It's just the way things are." Ethan's heart tightened as he heard the vulnerability in her voice. He had always assumed that people like Sophie had everything figured out, that she was just another person in his world who didn't need anything from him. But now, he realized how wrong he had been. "You don't have to do everything alone," Ethan said, his voice firm but gentle. "No one should have to." Sophie looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. Finally, she nodded, though there was still a hesitation in her gaze. "Maybe not," she said softly. "But it's hard to let go of the things you've carried for so long." Ethan nodded, understanding more than he let on. He had spent so many years carrying the weight of his own choices, his own decisions. But Sophie was different. She had carried her burdens silently, without anyone noticing. It was clear now that there was so much more to her than he had ever realized. He had always admired her quiet strength, but now, he saw something even deeper, something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. As the evening drew to a close, Sophie finished her shift and began to gather her things. Ethan stood up, watching her with a new sense of understanding. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. Sophie had changed something inside of him, and he couldn't just walk away from that. "Take care of yourself," he said softly as she walked toward the door. Sophie turned, giving him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You too, Ethan," she replied quietly, before disappearing into the night. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, the weight of her words lingering in the air. It wasn't just about her strength anymore. It was about her willingness to let him in, even just a little. And that small crack in the wall she had built around herself made Ethan realize that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one who had been living in a world of isolation. It had been a week since the night Ethan and Sophie had exchanged those quiet words, and things had shifted in ways neither of them fully understood. Ethan kept finding reasons to return to the diner, not because he had business to attend to, but because he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was changing within him. He had always been the one to dictate how his days went, meetings, deals, acquisitions. But now, every time he thought of Sophie, he felt something he hadn't in years: uncertainty. Sophie, on the other hand, seemed just as composed as always, but there was a noticeable change in the way she looked at him. It wasn't that she had started seeking his attention. No, she was still as quiet and reserved as ever, but there was an openness now, a willingness to allow their interactions to last a little longer. It was subtle, but it was there. Ethan had never been good at understanding people's emotions. He had always relied on facts, on logic, on what could be measured. But with Sophie, things were different. He felt like he was learning a language he hadn't spoken in years. One afternoon, Ethan sat at the counter again, his usual place, watching Sophie move between tables. She was taking her time with each customer, listening carefully, her attention unwavering. She had always been like that, Ethan realized. Always present. He noticed a few people looking at her differently, almost as if they were seeing her for the first time. There was something magnetic about her, something that drew people in. It wasn't her appearance, though she was beautiful in an understated way. It was the way she carried herself. The calm, the grace, the quiet confidence. Ethan watched as she approached him. "What can I get you today, Mr. Blackwood?" Sophie asked, her tone polite, but somehow warmer than usual. Ethan hesitated, looking up at her with a soft smile. "Just coffee today," he said, his voice a little quieter than normal. He had come to realize how much he looked forward to these small moments with her, how much he enjoyed the simplicity of her presence. Sophie nodded and went off to the kitchen, leaving Ethan with his thoughts. As the hours passed, the diner grew quieter, the rush of the day starting to ebb away. Ethan found himself lost in his mind, reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. He had come to this diner many times over the years, but he had never felt this sense of longing for something more, something different. He didn't know what it was yet, but it was beginning to dawn on him that it wasn't just about Sophie's quiet strength or her unwavering calm. It was about the way she made him feel like he could be more than just the sum of his achievements. He could be more than his wealth, his status, his power. He could just be. When Sophie returned with his coffee, she set it down gently in front of him, her fingers brushing his just briefly. Ethan's heart skipped a beat at the simple gesture. She didn't say anything, but for a moment, their eyes met, and Ethan knew that there was something unspoken between them. Something that neither of them was ready to voice yet, but that was there nonetheless. "I'll be right over there if you need anything," Sophie said softly before turning away, her voice carrying just enough warmth to send a ripple through Ethan's chest. Ethan watched her go, feeling something he hadn't in a long time: vulnerability. It was the strangest sensation, like he was standing on the edge of something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't walk away from it now. Sophie had shown him a side of life he had forgotten, a side that wasn't about business or control. It was about real connection, real understanding. And for the first time in his life, Ethan found himself wondering if he was ready to open up to something more, something real. The next morning, Ethan woke up with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. As he stood by the window in his apartment, looking out over the city, he realized that something had shifted inside of him. Sophie had changed him, and though he couldn't fully explain it, he knew he had to see her again. He couldn't just go on pretending that everything was fine, that he was fine. He had built his life on power, on control, but the more he thought about Sophie, the more he understood that none of that mattered if he didn't have something real. He hadn't felt that before, not in any of his business dealings or relationships. What he had with Sophie was different. It was simple, genuine. It wasn't about what either of them could gain from the other. It was about connection. The thought made him feel vulnerable in a way he wasn't used to, but it was a vulnerability he was willing to embrace. That morning, Ethan found himself walking into the diner, the familiar scent of coffee and fresh pastries greeting him as soon as he stepped inside. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he hoped it was the same thing that had brought him back so many times before, the comfort of Sophie's presence. Sophie was there, as always, moving between tables, her calm demeanor never wavering. As soon as she saw him, she made her way over, a small, polite smile on her face. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood." "The usual?" she asked, her voice still as professional as ever. But Ethan noticed the subtle change in her. Her eyes were softer, almost like she was waiting for something. "Yeah, the usual," he replied, his voice steady but betraying a hint of uncertainty. He wasn't sure how to ask what he needed to, but he knew he had to try. "Sophie, can I talk to you for a minute?" Her brow furrowed just slightly, but she nodded and set down her notepad. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to put his thoughts into words. He had spent so long controlling every aspect of his life, but now, with Sophie, he didn't know where to start. "I don't know how to say this, but," he trailed off, trying to find the right words. Sophie stood there, patient, her gaze steady and understanding. She wasn't rushing him, wasn't expecting anything from him. That alone made Ethan feel more at ease. "I've been thinking a lot about everything lately. About my life, my choices, and about you." He looked up at her then, searching her face for a reaction. Sophie didn't say anything at first, but the look in her eyes softened. It wasn't surprise or discomfort. It was more like curiosity, like she was waiting for him to continue. "I've spent so much time focusing on control, on power, and I've never really stopped to think about what I actually want," Ethan continued, his voice quieter now. "But being here, with you, I realize that I don't want to keep living the way I have been. I want something more. I want to be real. And I think that starts with being honest with myself, and with you." Sophie didn't immediately respond, but she didn't need to. Ethan could see the wheels turning in her mind, her thoughtful gaze never leaving his. After a moment, she nodded slowly. "It's not always easy, is it?" she said softly. "Being real. Letting go of the things you've been holding on to for so long." Ethan exhaled, feeling a sense of relief he hadn't expected. Sophie had a way of cutting through the layers he had built around himself, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was allowed to just be. "No," he replied, his voice quieter now. "It's not. But I'm willing to try. I think you've already taught me more than I ever expected to learn." Sophie smiled then, the kind of smile that reached her eyes, and for a brief moment, Ethan felt like he wasn't alone in this. Like he wasn't the only one trying to figure out what it meant to live authentically. "You don't have to do it alone, you know," Sophie said gently. "Sometimes, the best thing we can do is let someone else in." The simplicity of her words hit Ethan harder than he expected. She wasn't just offering him a chance at something more. She was offering him something he had always avoided: trust. The kind of trust that could break down the walls he had spent his life building. As the moments passed, Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders, the uncertainty slowly giving way to something else. Something that felt like hope. He wasn't sure where this was going, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't need to. All he knew was that he wasn't going to walk away from it. He wasn't going to walk away from Sophie, and that realization, in itself, was enough. He smiled back at her, a small but genuine smile that felt like the first step towards something new. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady now. Sophie gave him a slight nod, her eyes bright with an understanding that spoke volumes without saying a word. "Anytime," she replied, and in that simple exchange, Ethan knew that things were already different. Things were already changing. The following week, things between Ethan and Sophie began to feel different in the best way possible. Ethan continued to visit the diner, but not out of routine or habit anymore. He was there because he wanted to be. It wasn't about the food or the coffee, it was about the conversations, the moments they shared. He realized how much he had missed real human connection, how much he had taken it for granted all these years. Sophie, for her part, was still the same quiet, composed woman he had come to admire, but there was a new softness between them, a subtle understanding that didn't need to be spoken out loud. They began to talk more, not just about his business or her work, but about their lives, their dreams, their fears. It was strange for Ethan, who had always kept his personal life behind closed doors, to be so open, but with Sophie, it felt right. One afternoon, as the diner started to fill up with the usual lunchtime crowd, Ethan found himself once again seated at the counter. Sophie was in the middle of her shift, moving efficiently between tables, but when she came to check on him, there was a different energy in the air. "You've been quiet today," Sophie remarked, her voice gentle, almost teasing. Ethan looked up at her, surprised by the observation. "I guess I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about a lot of things." Sophie raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "About what?" she asked, leaning slightly closer, her eyes curious. Ethan hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to share. He had never been one to open up to anyone, especially not someone like Sophie, who had been so much of a mystery to him at first. But now, it felt different. About how much I've been missing, he said finally. About the way I've been living. I've spent so much of my life focused on business, on control, on making sure everything goes the way I want it to, that I've forgotten what it's like to just live. Sophie nodded, her expression understanding but not pitying. It's easy to get caught up in that, in thinking that success is the only thing that matters. But there's more to life than that. Ethan stared at her for a moment, surprised by the depth of her insight. He had always seen himself as someone who understood the world. After all, he had built his empire from the ground up. But Sophie, with her quiet wisdom, seemed to see something in him that no one else did. You're right, he admitted, his voice softer than usual. I've been so focused on climbing the ladder, I've forgotten what it means to enjoy the view. Sophie smiled, her eyes lighting up with warmth. It's never too late to stop and look around, she said. Ethan felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. For the first time in a long time, he realized he wasn't alone in this. Sophie wasn't just a waitress. She was someone who understood the value of real connection, of slowing down to appreciate the world around you. And for all the power and wealth he had accumulated over the years, that was something he had missed. As the afternoon wore on and the diner grew quieter, Ethan found himself growing more comfortable in Sophie's presence. There was no rush to anything, no expectation of grand gestures or deep conversations. It was just the two of them, sharing a quiet moment together, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. When Sophie finally had to return to work, Ethan felt a pang of disappointment, though he couldn't quite explain why. She wasn't just a part of his routine anymore. She had become a part of something deeper, something more meaningful. Before she walked away, Ethan reached out and gently touched her arm. Thank you, he said, his voice sincere. For everything. Sophie glanced at him, a soft smile on her lips. You're welcome, Ethan, she replied, her voice warm and steady. I'm glad you're starting to see things differently. Ethan watched her walk away, feeling something shift inside him. He wasn't sure where this would lead, but for the first time, he didn't feel the need to rush it. With Sophie, he had found something far more valuable than anything money could buy. A connection that was real, that was grounded in honesty and understanding. And that was worth more than anything he had ever earned. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Ethan found himself more drawn to Sophie, not just because of what she had done for him, but because of the person she was. She had a way of making everything seem simpler, as if all the noise in his life, the endless meetings, the constant pursuit of success, didn't matter. With Sophie, he found peace, something he hadn't known he was missing. It wasn't just about the quiet moments they shared, though those were precious to him. It was the way she challenged him without even trying. The way she made him question everything he thought he knew about success, happiness, and the way he had been living his life. Ethan had always defined himself by his achievements, by his ability to control every outcome, but now, he was beginning to wonder if that was enough. One evening, as the sun began to set and cast a soft orange glow across the city, Ethan found himself once again sitting at the counter of the diner. Sophie was just finishing her shift, and there was a calmness in the air, a sort of quiet that seemed to match his mood. When she approached him, she didn't ask for his usual order. Instead, she looked at him, her eyes thoughtful. You've been quiet today, she said, her voice gentle but curious. Ethan smiled slightly, feeling the weight of the question. I guess I've been thinking a lot about what you said, he replied, his voice steady but carrying an underlying honesty that hadn't been there before. Sophie raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. About how we sometimes forget to live, how we get caught up in all the things that don't really matter. Sophie nodded slowly, her gaze softening. It's easy to get lost in that, in thinking that achievement is everything, she said quietly. But what you're doing now, what you're starting to understand, that's what really matters. Ethan looked at her, his heart swelling with a feeling he couldn't quite name. He had spent so long looking for validation from the outside world, from his business, from the wealth he had accumulated. But it was Sophie who had shown him that true fulfillment didn't come from any of that. It came from moments like this, real, honest connection, with no expectation, no agenda. I don't know if I'm ready to let go of everything just yet, he said after a moment, his voice soft, almost uncertain. But I want to try. I want to see where this goes. Sophie smiled at him, a quiet, understanding smile. You don't have to be ready all at once, she said. It's about taking one step at a time. And you've already taken the first one. Ethan felt a rush of gratitude, something simple but profound. Sophie wasn't asking for anything in return. She wasn't pushing him to change, but rather, she was showing him the possibility of something better, something more meaningful. As Sophie prepared to leave for the night, she gave him a nod and a warm smile. Take care of yourself, Ethan, she said, her voice carrying a sincerity that made his chest tighten. And don't forget to look around once in a while. Ethan watched her walk out of the diner, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had come to the diner looking for something, a break from the chaos of his life, perhaps, or just a moment of quiet. What he had found, though, was so much more than that. He had found the possibility of a new life, one where he could stop running and start living, truly living. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but with Sophie's quiet guidance, Ethan knew that he could begin again. He could find a way to balance the drive for success with the need for authenticity, and maybe, just maybe, he could learn to live a life that was more than just about power and control. He stood up from the counter, a sense of clarity settling over him. As he walked out of the diner into the cool night air, he couldn't help but smile, knowing that the journey ahead, while uncertain, was one he was finally ready to take.